Despite being arrested for alleged human trafficking and rape in Romania last month, former kickboxer and self-appointed masculinity guru Andrew Tate has continued to gain followers across various social media platforms and has received support from several right-wing media figures.
Tate's predominantly male following believe he was arrested because he is, quote, going against the system, what he calls the matrix. Joining us now to discuss is senior editor at Reason, Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So you wrote a couple of years ago a great story for Reason magazine, where I also write about police efforts to grapple with sex trafficking and how they were butting up against some important civil liberties that were being violated. And I was trying the other day to explain that to Brianna, why not to defend Tate whatsoever, but why I would be just like a little cautious about, before just believing everything that was said about sex trafficking accusations. And I felt like I wasn't explaining it very well, so I said, why not just bring Liz on to explain it since she wrote the story? So can you help us understand, what has happened in the U.S. context, at least, with efforts to prosecute or go after, alleged sex traffickers?
First I want to say that I don't have any special insight into the Andrew Tate case, and I'm certainly not here to defend him per se. But I am here, I can talk about why so many people may be defending him, aside from just a general disbelief about people you like accused of crimes, or the fact that some men are never going to believe accusations made by a woman against a man anyways. I think part of it also, though, is that the reality about sex trafficking in the U.S. is these cases are very frequently bogus, and stats about how common it is are very frequently just entirely made up. Like you said, this is something I've been writing about at Reason magazine for years. A lot of what gets publicized as sex trafficking busts in the U.S. just wind up being prostitution busts, with adults trying to consensually have sex with other adults. And very often it's the sex workers themselves who wind up arrested and charged and wind up with the most severe consequences. For example, take the Florida case that got a lot of attention a few years back because it busted Patriots owner Robert Kraft. There was this huge media blitz describing it as a sex trafficking bust, saying hundreds were arrested in a sex trafficking sting. Homeland Security helped install surveillance cameras inside these massage parlor rooms. And then ultimately, no one was ever charged with sex trafficking or anything even remotely related. A bunch of men were charged with soliciting prostitution, and then actually most of these charges against the men were dropped. So the only people who ultimately got punished and got punished severely were the women who worked at these massage parlors and provided the sex acts. And so many sex trafficking cases in the U.S. end up like this.
Right, and I think it's important to note in that case and others, they were not being held against their will. No. They were not, being like chained to a basement or something. These were people who were consensual, exchanging money for sex. Some people think that should be illegal and think that's wrong, et cetera, but it is not. It wasn't forced on anyone, and that's a huge difference in my mind, at least.
Right, like in the Florida case, these women were all in the United States legally. They had either green cards or they'd become U.S. citizens. They had their massage licenses. They were all in their 40s through 60s. So it was very different than this picture that got painted in the media. Often sex trafficking rumors on social media end up being false, too. It's amazing how often police are having to put out these press releases like, no, sex traffickers aren't snatching up people at your local Walmart or Target or things like that. So, you can see why people are skeptical of the Andrew Tate charges, even if it's not necessarily true, no matter what's going on in this case. Authorities are basically the boy who cried wolf about sex trafficking, and they've been crying sex trafficking on so many things that aren't sex trafficking for so long that it can be kind of hard to take them seriously.
Elizabeth, what do you make of the fact that it doesn't seem like there is a prostitution element? You described that one of the problems with the expansive definition of sex trafficking is that it often ends up hurting or punishing the people who are, the women, the people who are, working in this situation, as opposed to the folks who ostensibly are in the position of power and exploitation and control here. And this situation does strike me as something that's somewhat different from that prostitution pimp scenario, where Andrew Tate has been accused of kind of abusing, using fraudulently inducing, coercing women who are particularly very young. He said that he prefers to date 18 and 19-year-olds. There's some, people might read into that's playing it very close to the line. But that he uses younger, impressionable people it enables them, it gets them into his sphere of influence, creates a kind of a financial reliance between the two of them, and is able to get them to do whatever he wants them to do. And he said as much explicitly, right? He brags about how much control he has over these women and what he can do to these women. When you look at the fact pattern of the Andrew Tate case, does it strike you as the kind of case that typically gets kind of wrongly characterized, the kind of case that the sex trafficking rules are inappropriately applied to, or does this seem like a more appropriate use of that kind of charge?
Well, like I said before, I don't know what to believe about this case. I mean, I know that there are women who have made allegations against him. I know that a couple of the women who worked for him said, no, none of that is true. So I don't want to presume to know anything about what was actually going on there. I will say that a lot of what you just described actually is the kind of police spin we hear about so many of these cases, even when it's actually just women engaged in consensual sex work. So all of the things you said are often narratives that we do hear from.
Well, narratives aside, these are just quotes from Andrew Tate. Like that's what's so interesting about this case. There doesn't need to be speculation about what Andrew Tate believes he was doing. He went online and talked about and wrote about on his own website that this is his strategy with how to coerce women. I mean, he's very open about that. This isn't me projecting.
Right.
And the question, yeah.
I don't think that being a manipulative person, being a bad person is not necessarily sex trafficking. So again, I don't know if this fits the thing, but I do want to say that I'm not saying that he's innocent either. I just say I don't know. And the fact that there has been so much blurriness though about what sex trafficking actually is makes it easier for people who are doing something wrong to get away with it. So I think that if he was actually guilty, then he is benefiting from the fact that we have really blurred the lines about what sex trafficking is. So it makes it easier for him to say plausible deniability and no, I'm just a victim of this thing that's been happening in the media and politics for a long time.
And it is, sorry, just real quick, it is worth noting that he's also been charged with rape and running an organized crime ring. So even if the sex trafficking claim is just kind of a cherry on the indictment, there's a lot else here. Go ahead, Robby, I'm sorry. Yeah,
and I wanted you to speak to efforts, again, in the U.S. at least, to go after alleged sex traffickers and the massive violations of free speech and civil liberties that have taken place because of that. You've written about the shutting down of places like Backpage and Craigslist. Internet sites and forums that were totally complying with law enforcement and were actually helping to turn over when really bad actual people were discovered. They would absolutely participate with law enforcement, but that ended up being used against them, and it's just been this total witch hunt in the online context.
Yeah, and I think that, part of the big problem with this is we're wasting so many police resources just arresting adults who are trying to consensually have sex with each other, or arresting, like you said, websites that maybe were letting adult sex workers advertise for legal sex work or for maybe prostitution, which is a crime in most of the United States, but is not what we think of as sex trafficking, which involves minors or force or fraud or coercion. So we have so much resources going towards fighting that you aren't having the resources there to actually catch the bad guys. So it's like a double problem where you're both, violating everyone's civil liberties, violating the rights of sex workers, and not making anyone safer, and actually making things worse for the people who are actually victims of exploitation.
And they don't even prosecute the quote unquote bad guys in the situations where they are breaking up. They prosecute the women. Yeah, I think that's all very legitimate with respect to people who are in a traditional sex work scenario. But again, I think it's worth just reading some of the facts about what Andrew Tate's particular fact pattern are. This is from a Vox piece. Andrew Tate once said he moved from the UK to Romania because, quote, rape laws are more lenient there. This is what he has said about himself. Tate has probably admitted to some version of the charges already. The self-proclaimed king of toxic masculinity told the Daily Mirror that he and his brother once operated a, quote, total scam business in which 75 women were paid to talk to men for $4 per minute, and where the Tates would pocket most of the money. The charges, this is a little bit more specific about the charges. They say that Tate recruited victims by making them believe they were interested in genuine relationships, then transported them to live in houses where they were under constant surveillance and forced to act in porn videos under threats of violence. The videos would then be sold online. So, I mean, those are some substantive charges that it would seem there must be a good deal of evidence. I mean, there has to be material evidence for if we're talking about porn videos. We'll see which of the alleged victims are willing to testify against Tate and support these claims. Tate has said that
there was no victim in this. He took to Twitter in the last few days saying there are no victims here. So I think it's a matter of time before we see how this pans out. But it does seem clear that this seems to be something more substantive and more closer to the kind of exploitative behavior for commercial ends than like your typical prostitution scenario, sex work scenario. Does that feel right to you, Elizabeth?
Again, I think we just have to separate the things that are Andrew Tate's persona from the things that the police are saying. And the things that police are saying may well end up being true, but even bad people, I think, deserve a presumption of innocence, or at least not a presumption of guilt. So I wouldn't say just because he's said like some very misogynistic things or very, you know, about the way he treats women, that he's coercive and things like that. I wouldn't necessarily say that because that is his online persona that we should immediately think that anything police are saying about him is true. It might well very well be true. I just don't think that we can say for sure just because that the police are saying that that's what's going on.
Well, thank you so much for that, Liz. That was very, very helpful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.